All right, so that is close. Yeah, so F11 gets you. Is that good enough for you?
That's
right
good
here?
enough. Yeah.
All right, folks, if you'd like to grab your coffee and grab anything you'd like and go ahead and have a seat, we'll get started with our next session. All right, folks, if you'd like to grab your seat, let's go and start with the next section. And for the folks online, if you wouldn't mind, could you please tell me if online, if you can do this on chat, tell me if you can hear me now.
If we have the sound set correctly, then give me a let me know if you can hear me online. Excellent, thank you. Thank you. All right, our next speaker is someone that I've had the pleasure of meeting even before he came here to Vanderbilt, and I'm so glad that you did. We have not dissimilar backgrounds, but what's really fascinating to me is with Professor Alex Christensen, who's Assistant Professor of Psychology and Human Development in the Department of Psychology and Human Development, is that in addition to his quantitative interests, he also has an interest in psychology and has been diving really headfirst into novel application of deep learning networks and large language models in his examination of personality research. So I think you're really going to enjoy this type of his presentation and this take on large language models. So real pleasure to introduce and real pleasure to invite you up. Thank you so much, Alex.
Well, thank you, Jesse. It's also been a pleasure getting to know you, getting to know the rest of the folks here and the Data Science Institute, which I can say without reserve have just been a phenomenal experience working with y'all. I recommend working with the Data Science Institute with everyone I talk to. So so we're going to talk today about how these models can be applied to personality. And my perspective or my take is that personality really encompasses the whole person. We should really be emphasizing every aspect of the person, and that is what personality is. So what I would like to do today is have you first take a moment to think about what makes you you. And really try to dig in, think very in depth into what makes you you. The things that make you unique, the things that make you similar to other people, really dig into what that means. So, maybe enough time, maybe not. I'm sure many of you are much more complex than the time that I just gave you. But what I'd like to ask or see a show of hands if people would, whether you thought about goals you have, whether that was in relation to who you are as a person. No one thought about goals? Okay. How about values, things that are important to you? Values, definitely. Okay, perfect. Relationships, definitely a big one. Roles, responsibilities, yep, big part of our identities, and differences relative to others, who we are versus someone else. Yeah, some social comparison. So these really make up a lot about who we are. These also end up being things that are very difficult to capture. When we think about these things, just giving you a survey and asking you about these things, you end up producing and generating a lot of text, which, of course, as we've been talking about, is what these models do a great job of doing. So next, I would like to ask, what types of words did you think of? If you thought of words, I assume that you used language to think about who you are as a person. If anyone wants to throw out the types of words that they used when thinking about themselves. Curious. Good. So an adjective, right? So adjectives are by and large a big way how we talk about ourselves, talk about other people, and make it so we can understand different traits, thoughts, and ideas. Do I need to unmute? Okay. Okay, so in this part, language and narratives drive how we understand ourselves and others. This is a huge part for what makes up our psychology, much of what we think about, and in general, who we are as people. So this serves as sort of a ground base. It serves as a foundation for understanding our psyche, for understanding our psychology. So with that, I wanted to use that to kind of leverage to get an idea of where we've started and provide a background of the history of personality and psychology. And this goes to Francis Galton, who was looking at research on individual differences. And from that point forward, it's been a lot of language. It starts with the lexical hypothesis, which I'll get to in just a second, but it's been using adjectives to describe mental states, using unique terms to describe behaviors. And over time, statistics began to play more and a bigger role. So things like principal component analysis and factor analysis, which have been used to reduce these large quantities of text and adjectives, starting from over 17,000 and really whittling it down to what we call today the Big Five. So the Big Five were introduced in 1985, and this has really been the dominant model in psychology. Sometimes there's a sixth component added on there, but really for about 40 years now, we've been really focusing on these Big Five. Now, 5 seems like a small number to make up all of human personality. It definitely is a broad umbrella in which we categorize personality. But where this all starts is first with the lexical hypothesis. So the lexical hypothesis is 2 things. It starts first with characteristics that are important will become part of language. So characteristics that are important for describing ourselves and others will survive the test of time. The way in which we describe ourselves, the way in which things that are key components to who we are will be within the language we use. And these are going to often be encoded in language as single words, as adjectives. So this is the foundation, this is the starting place, which a lot of personality research has started. And this led us to the Big Five through dimension reduction and factor analysis type techniques. So the Big Five, if you're unfamiliar, is openness to experience, usually described by curiosity, intellectually motivated, and also aesthetically interested. Conscientiousness, working hard, being industrious, organized. Extroversion, I think this one is most often probably used in our language and how we talk about other people, whether someone likes to be outgoing, sociable, warm, as well as assertive. Agreeableness, how well we generally get along people, whether you're someone who likes to be very friendly and compassionate, or on the other side of the spectrum, a little bit more challenging or disagreeable, we will use very often. And then neuroticism, which sometimes represents the other end of extroversion, but really is kind of a focus on how often you experience negative affect, worry, anxiety, anger also falls into that category. And what psychologists really like to do, we like to put things in taxonomies. We like to think of things in hierarchies, and personality is one of those things that we've really kind of placed into this taxonomic structure. So for the Big Five here, is kind of in this middle section of this model here. We have a Big Two, so to speak, and of course, we have lower level characteristics that get a little bit more nuanced, a little bit more specific in how we would describe people. And again, these aren't just appearing out of thin air. These are appearing in our statistical models based on the dimension reduction analyses that we do. So things like principal component analysis and factor analysis is how we get to and arrive at that structure. But now here's the point that I tell you that Big Five is a big problem. So we've been doing this for about 40 years now. And despite 40 years of working on this research, we haven't made much more progress into understanding individual people. So what that means is that we can see big differences. When we talk about people and do research using the big five, it's often describing who people are, and it's often describing who people are relative to who they are to other people. So what this means is that we're not capturing the individual, we're capturing the individual and their relationship or their relative standing to other people. That does very little for us to understand who you are as a person. We could argue and say, well, I can understand who you are by understanding who you are relative to other people. Sure, that's certainly true. But what we end up doing when we have these big, large summary models is that we lose focus on the individual person, and we lose focus on the idiosyncrasies, what makes you unique. So one of the big things that ends up happening is that we often study people through single shot measures, questionnaire measures, self-report surveys. And when we do that, we often find this big five structure. We often find the big five traits. Now, one thing that happens when we look at people dynamically using a technique called experience sampling, we ping people on their cell phones daily, if not hourly, usually about every 4 hours or so, and people respond to these surveys on their phones. Maybe you've taken or been a part of one of these surveys before. And when people do that, when they're responding to the same big five questions that we normally do and get out the big five from, when we look at them dynamically and we compare their structures that we can reduce or put people in having certain dimensions of characteristics, what we end up finding is that people are not very similar to the big five at all. That is to say that the big five does not adequately capture or exist in any one person. And when we look at everyone compared to each other, just as a general glimpse of what this graphic is showing, is this is a measure just looking at how similar each person's structure is to every other person in this sample. And red there is going to be 0 for normalized mutual information, all the way up to 1. 1 is going to be perfectly identical, 0 is going to be very different. You don't see very much green up there. You see a little bit of yellow, a little bit of midpoint coloration there, but you see a lot of red and orange. So what does that tell us? When we look at individual people and their own individual characteristics, and we look at that across time, we see that everyone is unique. So in terms of our modeling, in terms of how we want to understand people, the big five is probably not the best way, at least in the sense of understanding who you are, who I am, and so forward. So there's other limitations that we have here too. So with the big five questionnaires, with questionnaires in general, self-reports, all we're able to do is ask you questions. And these are often specifically phrased questions. So we can ask questions that align with these big five traits. This is how we end up capturing or getting scores that we can position you relative to other people. I've listed some examples up there, and I'll just read off a couple of these so you can get an idea. So for open to experience, have a good imagination, like art, conscientiousness, excel in what I do, like order, extroversion, warm up quickly to others, love large parties, agreeableness, trust others, stick to the rules, and neuroticism, worry about things, get angry easily. So one thing to kind of notice here is that we're kind of stuck with the tool that we have, with the questions that we ask you. You may find yourself thinking, I see myself in some of these things, and maybe the opposite of some of these things, but there's unique pieces of me, or there's pieces of me that are missing from these questions that these questions are not capturing. And right now, this is the toolbox that we're using to probe who you are as a person. And so the question then becomes, how can we capture the breadth of each person? How can we capture who you are, what makes you unique? And this is where Transformers comes This is where these large language models, where we can now start to extrapolate who you are from text, from your writing, from your online profiles, your footprints. We can start to put together the pieces of who you are as a unique individual person. And we can do this in a way where we're not constrained by the questions we ask you. So we no longer need to just say, do you like art? Do you work really hard? We can get that information from the text. And if we don't get that information from the text, we can probably just ask you as well, right? So we can leverage these models to not limit ourselves in what we're able to ask and get information from you. So to outline a little bit of what I'll be talking about with these models and how we can leverage them, I'm going to start first with where this research with the DSI, Jesse, and others have led us to in terms of more formal concrete results. I'll talk about where we're right in the middle of and working on wrapping up. And then finally, I'll get to the big picture. Where is this all going? Where is this all leading to? So understanding response processes versus prompt engineering. If you're in this room, you probably are more familiar with prompt engineering or have heard of prompt engineering. Response processes might be a little bit less familiar. Response processes in psychology is how we understand or the way in which people respond to our questionnaire items. And we can think of this almost analogically to how these models respond to our prompts. So the way in which we prompt these models will influence the way in which they give us information back, right? I think if you've had any experience with the ChatGPT models or any of the chat models, you know the way in which you ask it a question, the information it gives you back is going to be different. Just like it would if it was a human, right? If you ask a human a question in one way versus another way, you're going to get a totally different response. So I've started thinking of response processes in psychology as a very similar analogical process as prompt engineering for these large language models. So I'm going to set up sort of an experiment of looking at what different prompts do to the distribution of these models when we look at personality. So we could, in effect, say we're looking at the personality of these models, or it's really the personality of these architectures, right? So we've done way more than the 3 models that I've listed here, but I've listed just a few of them to kind of show the differences just based on the size of the model. So using zero-shot classification on these personality items, we then extracted these characteristics or themes based on the personality structure. So zero-shot classification, if you're unfamiliar, is going to be just the model, the base model, and its then ability to classify or draw out a theme, the probabilities that your text belongs to some theme. So we get probabilities across all the themes that we give it, and we can extrapolate based on those probabilities the most likely response. So for the models we use MobileBERT, DistillBERTA, and RoBERTA. The main differences between these models are going to be the training and the size, but really going to more focus on the size. So MobileBERT is going to be transformer models that are more designed for mobile phones, right? These need to be smaller. They can't be super large because we only have so much space on our cell phones. DistillBERT, a little bit larger. They're distilled down versions of the larger full-scale models to be a little bit more efficient, a little bit faster in processing, but still try to produce the same results as the full models. And then, of course, RoBERTA Large is going to be the largest model here. This is most likely going to be the most accurate, but also the slowest in processing. So we use 2 different personality inventories here. These are 2 very common ones used in psychology. And what we did then was we asked via prompts as we would any participant that we have in a study. So we used just sort of a standard prompt that is often just given to folks when we give a survey. Sometimes we'll give fuller instructions at the very beginning, but as you're going through the survey, we'll just resort to saying things like, is outgoing, sociable. The next prompt is going to be, so we'll call that standard. The next prompt is going to be person who. So adding a little bit more context, adding a little bit more to the prompt to say, I'm a person who is outgoing and sociable. Not that big of a change. Wouldn't expect that big of a change in human respondents because we're not really adding that much more context to the prompt. The next one is probably more common in the sense of we want to give people a rating scale and describe themselves on this rating scale. So what we said was, please use the rating scale below to describe how accurately each statement describes you. And then that leads into, I'm a person who is outgoing and sociable. Finally, the fourth represents how we theoretically, at least through modeling, think about how we might ask people to respond to these models. So this gets lengthy for each one of these. So this is how I describe myself as I am now, not as I wish to be in the future. This is how I describe myself as I honestly see myself in relation to other people I know of the same gender as I am and roughly the same age. And then that leads into, I am a person who is outgoing and sociable. And you can think about how you might respond to these same questions. When phrased in this way, in this broader, more expansive scope, that might change the way you were originally thinking about how you would respond to is outgoing and sociable. So finally, the standard way of having people respond and how we had these models respond was from 1 to 5, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1 being strongly disagree, 3 being neutral or no opinion, and 5 being strongly agree. So again, we fed these prompts into the model with each of these items in these personality inventories. What we did, just for simplicity of presentation here, is we collapsed using a weighted average of the responses from the models to get distributions out for each of the traits. And this is what we saw. So for the big 5 inventory 2, open-mindedness, I'm going to use the openness to experience, open-mindedness trait as the examples here. Hopefully one thing you can quickly see just by looking at it is that some of these distributions look a little different. I'm going to give you a little bit more of a crash course orientation to what you're looking at here. So on the x-axis is going to be the response, 1 being strongly disagree, 5 being strongly agree. On the y-axis, we have those prompts. So the standard prompt, person who, rating scale, and theoretical. So as you go up the y-axis, the length and the context that we provide in the prompt gets more elaborate. On the right-hand side, it may be a little hard to see. On the top is negative, on the bottom is positive. These are the way in which the items were phrased. So a negatively worded item would be, I do not like to go to parties for extroversion. And a positively worded item would be, I like to go to parties. And that would be for extroversion. So negative is going to reflect the opposite of the specific trait. And then finally, going across the top, or going across from left to right, we have Roberta, starting with the largest model on the left, Distilbert, and Mobilbert. So that's how we're going to set up these plots here. And hopefully what you're able to see, or what quickly jumps out, is that the more elaborate, the more context you add to the prompt, the more, or at least better behaved, the distributions seem to come, at least for the larger models. Now, if we look at Mobilbert, it seems to be maybe the smaller, the less context you have for the negatively worded items, it does better. But then the more context for the positive, it does better. But as we move over, as the models get larger, they get a bit more well-behaved with the more context that you provide in the prompt. When we looked at Roberta here, what we can see is If we just give standard instructions for the positively and the negatively worded items, we get bimodal distributions. This is really not something we would like to see in terms of the distributions that kind of come out from the response processes. We're expecting these things to be normally distributed. So this is really not something we would like to see. The last thing that I'll kind of point out here is that dashed line is representing the midpoint of the response. So here, what we're able to see is perhaps a little bit of the personality of the models. So it looks maybe like that mobile BERT is a bit more open to experience than the other models, at least with some of the other interpretations we might be able to draw with the instructions there. Whereas both Roberta and Distilbert are around the midpoint. And we actually see that too with the negatively valence items there. The more to the left, the more to the lower ratings of the scale, we would expect to see lower ratings if it's higher openness to experience. So again, mobile BERT, our a little openness to experience transformer there is definitely more skewed to that left side. So this is for the openness to experience. We did this for all of the other traits. I realize there's a lot going on here, and I'm not going to go and break down every single one of these images. The general gist that I will provide, and hopefully you can see a little bit, is the same pattern that we saw with that open-mindedness. The more context we give the model, the more context in the prompt, the more normally distributed the responses become. The more we see that desirable response, or at least the theoretically desirable response from the models. What happens if we switch questionnaires? So the previous one, we were working with about 60 items. We're now working with 300 items. So about 5 times the size. And what ends up happening is we get a little bit cleaner distributions. We get a little bit cleaner images of the shape of the distributions here. So again, the big takeaway here is shorter prompts, less contextual information provided in the prompts. We really get some wonky, wavy distributions here that are not desirable versus the nice normal distributions we're getting with the common prompts. Again, mobile BERT just so open to experience. Same patterns with the rest of the traits here, really kind of wonky, bimodal, wavy distributions here. And what we end up seeing is the more context, the more or better normal distributions. So what this is leading to, or what the takeaway is here, is that prompt engineering may be a way to help us understand how people will respond before administering a scale. Now, I realize that's a big leap and a big jump, right? We're talking about a large language model. We're not talking about people, but hear me out. I'm gonna give you a little pitch here. So if we think about the data that these models are trained on, they are trained on large, copious amounts of text. So there's a lot of information and language built into these models. Well, where is that language coming from? It's coming from all of us, right? It's coming from a large population of people for, I think, the data that these were trained on, mainly English speakers. So it's coming from a large population of people. Well, when we administer these surveys and we extract out these big 5 traits, we're often summarizing and capturing over broad masses of the population, many people. And we're often trying to generalize to the population. So hopefully you can start to see a little bit of an equivalence here. What ends up, or at least the takeaway that I'm taking away from this, is that these large language models can be what we might expect the general population to respond to based on the prompts that we give it. So what we can start doing is perhaps leveraging these models by learning how they might respond to different ways of us posing questions. And we might be able to then begin to understand how people also respond to different ways of us using different prompts and posing questions. And in effect, hopefully getting to more valid and more representative responses from people, as well as really homogenizing the response processes that they're using. So that is the full study that we have put together, but I think this is where things get really interesting. So as I said before, with these large language models, they can analyze large amounts of text. And if we could get information from text rather than providing these self-report responses, we can start to understand individual people a whole lot better. So I will read the text here because I realize it's probably pretty hard to see on the screen, but I'll introduce you to the general idea first. So this book, Letters from Jenny, is a well-known case study of a woman named Jenny and her written letters. And this is a very well-known case study in psychology, particularly personality psychology. So Jenny was a 58 to 70-year-old woman when she wrote a series of 301 letters to two of her younger friends, a married couple, Glenn and Isabel. The husband of the pair, Glenn, was a roommate of Jenny's son, Ross, who passes away midway through the letters. And their correspondence begins in March 1926 and ends in October 1937, when Jenny passes. So there is about 11 years worth of transpondence between Jenny and her pair of correspondents, Glenn and Isabel. And what we're trying to do is use these models to capture who Jenny is, who she is through her writings and experiences that she's then sharing with Glenn and Isabel. And I will say this data set, this text has been analyzed many times with many different text analyses, but nothing even close to as sophisticated to as what these large language models can do. So the nice part about that is we can leverage and we can ask who Jenny is using the Big Five questionnaire items, which did not exist at the time that Jenny was alive. We can also ask, so I'm skipping a part here, these models will be trained on Jenny's letters. So the responses that we get should be then biased towards who Jenny is. So what we can then do is get out that same Big Five responses that we were getting before, and we can compare back to the baseline of the models to extrapolate who Jenny is relative to this baseline. What we can also do is leverage previous text analyses, themes that people who have read through all of these letters and extrapolated about Jenny. We can do the same thing with these models using those same themes to see if we come to the same conclusions. And the other big idea here is that we can contextualize the narratives. Who is Jenny writing to? Can we tell based on Jenny's responses or the prompts that we give to Jenny, if we can tell who she's writing to? Does the writing change with who she's writing to? And I think more specifically in terms of a narrative, does her writing change after her son dies, which we might expect? Does her writing change when talking about her son, who is an integral part of her life? So all of these things we can capture through these models that we'll have trained on Jenny's writing. So this I'll move into the big picture, talking a little bit more high level here, is what we can start to do as this sort of proof of concept shows, is we can capture personality structures in narratives. We can start to understand individual people through their writing, through their personal narratives. And what we can then do, so to give an example of a study that we've set up, is we can allow people to tell us who they are. Right now, we're using a study where they pick out and define idiosyncratic adjectives, describing themselves, and we can monitor these dynamics of these signatures. So they are doing that experience sampling study over time of how much they, for example, value their work that they're doing or value the time they're spending with their family, and even more specific things, for example, generating new ideas that might be incredibly important to them. I think one of the kind of broad scope, larger picture things, and we can especially think of this with these chat models, is Can we use writings with these chat models? And this is really extrapolating here. Can we use writing with these chat models to also understand who individuals are based on their interactions, since there's so much text data that's being collected with these chat models. And then finally, I think the ultimate goal here is to be able to do some predictive modeling based on person-situation interactions. The ultimate goal here would be able to try to understand how people might respond to certain situations, how people might leveraging these models to better understand people's health and life outcomes. So with that, I want to thank particularly Dr. Emery Beck. She has been an inspiration in terms of going in this direction of more idiosyncratic and focused on the individual person level research. Of course, Dr. Jesse Spencer-Smith, Ricky Sun, and the rest of the data science team for their help in pursuing this work. Thank you.
Let's take time for some questions, so please.
That was fascinating. I'm really interested in the kind of broader implications of understanding this through text and personas and things like matchmaking, like predicting who would be a good pair, or on the dark side, like people using information like this to determine whether this person is a person I should hire to
work in my lab where our personalities sync. So what are kind of the implications of some of the things you're going to uncover?
I mean, I think
there's a lot that you just touched on right there. What hopefully it can enable us to do is I think the biggest thing that we have is finding good person fit in terms of situations. And so hopefully, I think what people find most fascinating about personality research and learning about themselves is just that. I think this is why I think personality is an attractive topic for many people, is we can better understand ourselves. So I think through achieving some better understanding of ourselves, we can hopefully fulfill different parts of our lives. So when this comes to dating, the better knowledge we have of ourselves, perhaps the better knowledge we have of who we might like and not like. We can also potentially understand how people might interact in different situations that might be more beneficial versus not. Like, for example, if I tend to go more introspective and be a bit more of a person who kind of closes up when conflict arises, is the person I'm with a good match for that or not? Now, I'm always tentative to go, I think, kind of deeper into that area because I think there's a lot of dynamics. As soon as you start introducing other people, the dynamics become multiplicative, right? And you end up getting into spaces that become much different. And I think that's where leveraging these models of how we write, talk, and speak to one another will be able to provide some of more of that nuance. And I think for health, understanding who's more likely to be taking their meds and following the schedule for the healthcare versus not, huge implications there, right? We know that outcomes in medicine really rely on how well people follow through on their regimens. So I think learning and developing who people are and what they're likely to do versus not likely to do in different situations can hopefully lead to better life outcomes for everyone.
And just potential manipulation of people also.
It does, yes. Yeah, I stayed away from the negative side. I'm trying not to bring it there.
So you talked about the big five, and I was wondering about more of the temporal dynamics, where right now you made it seem like a very static image. And I was wondering if you have any way to manipulate either historical data to look at, temporal changes instead of just thinking about this personality as something that's fixed versus being something that can be like changed or changes over time, I guess.
100%. No, I'm very much a proponent and view people personality as dynamic systems. And so people change over time. And I think that can also be reflected in how they present themselves through their writing, through their interactions. And
I think all of that can come out, and especially, it goes back to understanding the system and how can we best do that. And I think at the end of the day, we need to know as much as we can, life history and where we've been, where we're at and where we're going. And so that's where I think goals and values, I think, can really speak to those. Values perhaps reflect a lot of where we've been and where we are. And goals, I think, reflect a lot of the future, what we see, what we want to do. And these are all built into the narratives that we have. So I think through understanding goals, values, and prompting people to talk about those things can help us better understand who people are as people, and hopefully getting in touch with some of that life history. But fully agree. This is, I think, where a lot of the field is heading, is away from these kind of static interpretations or static representations and relations between people, and more into the dynamic and interactions of individuals. Totally.
I had two quick follow-ups.
Yeah.
For your surveys, are you able to add in like open-ended questions? That way people can supply more context, because now you have these language models.
That's right.
And they're able to learn from their responses.
That's right. That's 100%. And I jokingly the other day, talking with Ricky and Emery here, that I think surveys may be dead, just in the sense of what we're able to do with these models. And I think there's still utility and they're still very useful. But I think in the sense of, if we want to be able to capture the dynamics, there are just things I cannot ask you about your day in my survey questions that you can just straight out tell me. And those are going to end up being probably more important for developing an understanding of your trajectory, well-being in the short term, and where your life is heading in the long term.
Then my last question was, have you looked at expanding this to using other languages? Because there might be some concepts that you essentially have a bias in the results due to the fact that different languages might have different architecture or certain concepts that don't necessarily translate one-to-one. And then are done using these, have you run into any problems, tokenizing these languages into these language models, which might lead to some conflicts in actually, implementing this on a broader, global context?
Yeah, so that latter is a wonderful question, I think, for Jesse and the DSI team that I know less about. But I will talk about how I think these models are able to help us because they can be multilingual, multimodal. I think they can resolve some of those issues of where we may not have the direct conceptual connections. And so I think because of that, like the models that are being trained right now on Jenny's letters, it's all in English. So there is that issue isn't present. But as soon as we move into people, I think that's going to be key, is especially using the models that are multilingual and multimodal to understand people. 100%.
I just have a quick question about how you are calibrating a person's kind of textual self with their kind of either spoken or internal self. And you open the session asking us all to think about ourselves. And in a brief version of that, I didn't hear anyone think of themselves as a text generating machine, even though now that I think about what it means to be an academic, we might be. Yet most of the training we're doing is on kind of text output. So what is the state of the art in how we transfer from text representations of who we think we are and how we present ourselves to the world to the ones that are spoken and then maybe internal? And I know the field has covered these things, but how do you modulate that with these large language models?
Yeah, so I think this is where this is still a new frontier for us. I think a lot of this is has yet to be implemented or be able to be implemented. So I think these are ideas that we're moving with going forward. So in the sense of, I think what these large language models enable us to do is to leverage a lot of that internal space that we're not maybe able to capture through other mediums. And you can start to think about how these things might be paired with other mobile sensing devices and things like Whisper to start integrating people's environments and when they're out interacting with other people, as well as people's own internal thoughts. And so I think where it comes down to is our data is going to be as good as the way in which the person can fully describe themselves and have self-knowledge about themselves. What we'll end up having to do, I think, is leverage or compare against um, the text data, I assume image and video data going forward, and bringing those together to kind of bring that whole person perspective. Don't know if that gets you the answer of your question, but it's a good one and it's a tough one, and I will end it by saying I don't know.
Thank you so much.